So apparently it's the 70th anniversary of publication of 1984, which means better time than any to do my video about the American War on Language. Well, George Orwell was a very big student of language, and he understood probably better than anyone else that the words that we use basically are controlling our thoughts. So if you can get somebody to change the words that they're using, you're actually changing the way they think. So, because we're creatures of words, we express ourselves in words. We understand our own feelings in words. We might not feel in words, but we understand those feelings in words. And so it's very, very important to have a handle on what language we're using. And that's why you have terms, I mean, the 1984 examples being ignorance is strength, war is peace, freedom is slavery. And it's basically gotten to the point where that's reality. 1984 obviously wasn't meant to be an instruction manual. We've all said this before. But it's should be basically filed in the nonfiction section by now, I think. Freedom is slavery has become actual reality. The U.S. Department of Energy came out with a press release last week basically referring to liquefied natural gas as molecules of freedom. Freedom gas. Both terms they actually used in this press release. Now, I had to read it a couple times to make sure I wasn't getting, onioned. Satire is dead, basically. We know this ever since, I think it was a church that decided they didn't want to refer to God with a male pronoun. I think that was the moment that satire died, but we can agree to disagree on this one, but I would like to hear your thoughts. Anyway, so I had to read that a couple times to make sure that it was actually meant, freedom gas. What the? Are you serious? And it's because they're building in Texas an export terminal for liquefied natural gas to try to push this stuff on Europe and Asia, because Russia, of course, is building pipelines, almost done with a couple of pipelines actually, that will supply Europe and China, and the rest of Asia as well, with relatively cheap natural gas that doesn't have to go halfway around the world as ours would. So American liquefied natural gas is quite a bit more expensive because it's got to get out of the ground and it's got to get halfway around the world. You can't just put it through a pipeline because pipelines don't go in the ocean. So we have to convince these countries that they really need American natural gas. How do you do that? Oh, you sell it as freedom. That's how you do it. That's how we've always done it, right? That's how the American way has always been sold. Freedom. I mean, it's self-parody to the extreme. But it's also, it's the opposite of freedom, because if you're buying natural gas from America, then you are saddled with the whole American bullshit of foreign policy, and you can't do business with Russia anymore. I mean, just look at what happened to Turkey when they tried to buy Russian weapons in addition to their American weapons. The U.S. was like, well, we're not going to do business with you anymore, we're not going to service you anything, and we're not going to give you parts. So, yeah, you can go screw yourself. And, so what did Turkey do? Well, they said, no, the Russians got better missiles, I think we'll go with them. So the U.S. is just basically taking aim at his foot and firing rapid fire now. But I don't know what the end goal of this is, but it's become literally freedom is slavery. You can enslave yourself to the United States in return for freedom gas. That's the thing. Yes, it's funny, freedom gas, molecules of freedom, can't help but laugh at that. But it really is quite sinister, because freedom obviously is an integral concept to an ideal functioning human society. You need freedoms freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom from want, all of these freedoms. And the U.S. is basically making a mockery of these things by saying, oh, well, no, freedom is the freedom to buy American products. What? A freedom of choice between Pepsi and Coke. What? No, that's not freedom, dude. That's consumer bullshit. It's really obscene, and yes, obscene is actually the right word, because it's such a disgusting perversion of what it once meant to be a human, being able to make free will. Freedom of will is not free anymore, as the saying goes. Freedom isn't free. Ever since, freedom isn't free, yeah, go fuck yourself. But yeah, it's and NGOs like Freedom House, which have basically been used to label any regime we don't like as, oh, it's a dictator. We gotta go in there and give them a little taste of freedom. Yeah, you know what it is. And so it's unfortunate that this word has been turned inside out like this, because then how do you express something that means freedom, like actual freedom? You can't, because it's going to at least subconsciously connote for you, for anybody listening, all these other types of freedom. This sort of cynical, a version of freedom that is not in the mirror image of 1984-esque freedom. So that's the problem, because how do we express ourselves if we can't use that word anymore? This is deliberate, and this is definitely not an accident. You might say, oh well, yeah, they're just using that because it's like freedom fries. No, it's very deliberate on their part. They don't want people to be free. Freedom of speech and freedom of the press. In case you hadn't noticed, my own website getting deplatformed for, the better part of a month. There's a very coordinated assault on these freedoms. So they don't want you to have them. They want, when you think freedom, you want to think of freedom gas. No long lines at the pump. Get out from under the thumb of Russia. No, Russia's not the one with the thumbs, dude. Russia's not the one with the hundreds of military bases around the world. Also, we got, speaking of the U.S., democracy. Now, of course, it's become a running joke that the U.S., when it goes around bombing countries, is bringing democracy. But when you really think about it, okay, so what are these, mostly Middle Eastern right now, but also in the 1980s it was Latin America. We basically felt the need to go into all these places and overthrow their leaders, and South America. So what do these countries actually believe democracy is? Because if their only exposure to the concept has been at the end of a U.S. rifle, or at the end of a U.S. Missile, then they don't really have an experience with what actual democracy is. So, and then in that case, who's right? If billions of the world's people have only experienced this one kind of democracy and not the real thing, whatever that is, representative democracy or a democratic republic or whatever, then, if we're going to go by the democratic principle, it would be the majority rules, right? So democracy is actually oppressive, evil, just rule by force. I don't think that's necessarily the case, but again, when you're operating on this principle whereby this word connotes these things to these people, it's very difficult to argue in the alternative. It's the same thing as freedom gas. When you think democracy, you're thinking, oh, well, we're bringing democracy to the benighted Middle East, or bringing democracy to the benighted Latin America, or, God forbid, bringing democracy to Southeast Asia. And unfortunately, all of these countries that we overthrow, whether through color revolutions or through actual military intervention, regime change, they never end up becoming democracies. They're usually just puppet regimes put in place that occasionally have some of the trappings of democracy. They might allow for show elections, or make a big show of opening up and liberalizing markets. But yeah, liberalizing markets is not liberalizing anything else. Yeah, the first thing that they did after overthrowing Gaddafi and raping him to death with a bayonet was to install a central bank. Now, I'm sorry, what kind of revolution when the first thing that happens is that the dictator is finally gone, I think we want a central bank. Wait, what? Really? I thought you wanted to, have some freedom. But then again, what does that mean? So, as you can see, Orwell was really onto something with this whole language thing, and there is a definite assault on what words mean in the English language. This is very, very deliberate, and it needs to be called out when it's seen. Another word that's been completely drained of meaning and now no longer is anything but a terrible parody of itself is resistance. Now, we all talk about the hashtag resistance and the Mick resistance, and everybody's got their own pet name to make fun of the anti-Trump, rabid anti-Trump. I'm not merely anti-Trump. The anti-Trump resistance has now taken the word resistance and stomped on it and turned it inside out and made it mean this total joke of itself. Now how do you describe a resistance, a legitimate resistance movement? You can't use that word because people are going to immediately think of this anti-Trump raving Mueller crap. And so why would this be used? Well, obviously it was done on purpose. This is definitely deliberate. The group Indivisible that formed in opposition to Trump to basically do to Trump what the Tea Party did to Obama, which was be completely obstructionist, not allow him to get anything done, basically just stalled the machinery of government for 4 years. This group has been the core of the quote-unquote resistance. We don't hear about it a lot anymore, but when they first came on the scene in the aftermath of the election, this was the group around which all of these other groups formed. Anyway, I wrote about this. I can link the article here. And yeah, so resistance has now been eviscerated. Doesn't mean resistance anymore. It just means kind of a sad, pathetic joke. So what do you use instead when you want to mean resistance? So you could say opposition, but opposition is kind of vague. It doesn't, I mean, it can mean a bunch of things. It's not as precise. And this is definitely part of the war on language is a erosion of precision. If you can't express yourself precisely, you don't have, your ideas don't have the force that they would have otherwise. And it's much easier to, if the other side, the ruling class, has the precision on their side, because their words aren't being degraded and perverted. Their words are totally fine. Nobody's waging war on their language. So it's only our side that is being just completely destroyed. So resistance is dead. Liberals definitely dead. Unfortunately, liberals have only themselves to blame for this one. We've allowed the very small vocal minority of social justice warriors to basically hijack the term and use it to mean the opposite of what it used to mean. Liberal now means thought police fascists. You can watch my video about this for a in-depth examination of the phenomenon, but basically, like, liberal used to mean, like, open to new ideas and, like, Enlightenment values and stuff, and now it just means, like, this knee-jerk sort of politically correct thought policing, just taking offense on the behalf of others, society of the victim. It's all kinds of really unpleasant things tied up in a little package, and this was definitely done deliberately. Well, of course, there's hate. I mean, I already did a whole video about hate, and what a joke that is, because, I mean, hate just means you feel strongly against something. It doesn't mean necessarily bigotry or racism or anti-Semitism, of course, the dread anti-Semitism. Of course, there's another word that's been completely redefined. They're literally redefining the word. The International Holocaust Remembrance Association has decided that anti-Semitism no longer means hatred of Jews. It means criticism of Israel, which is like, wait, what? You can't just like redefine a word that has that kind of like gravitas to it, or at least it used to before they started applying it to everyone and their mom. I mean, now it is kind of a joke. I mean, there's enough footage of, like, Israeli government officials saying, yes, it's a trick, we always use it.
Often when there is dissent expressed in the United States against policies of the Israeli government, people here are called anti-Semitic. What is your response to that as an Israeli Jew?
Well, it's a trick. We always use it. When from Europe somebody is criticizing Israel, then we bring up the Holocaust. When in this country people are criticizing Israel, then they are anti-Semitic.
That it really should have just died an ignominious death by now, but they still keep whipping it out, and the ADL is still flogging that dead horse, and there are actual anti-Semites out there. However, most of them actually are like the ADL. I mean, the ADL tries to conflate Jewish people with the state of Israel when it's like most Jewish people are not really interested in being lumped in with these complete psychopaths that are just murdering civilians by the bucketful, testing nerve gas and all sorts of hideous, like, medical procedures on the Palestinians. The nerve gas thing is just like, and these are the people who think that we should be going to war with Syria over gas attacks that Assad didn't do. But, yeah, nerve gas. Dudes, seriously. No, most Jews don't want anything to do with these people. And so the ADL trying to get us to think that anti-Semitism is anti-Israel is the same thing as criticizing Israel. These are the people who are anti-Semitic because they're conflating Jews with complete psychopaths. That's pretty bigoted, I would say. I mean, I think Starbucks had actually canceled its bias training that they had a contract with the ADL because they were just such a joke. And Twitter, to their credit, has dropped the SPLC as one of its, like, trusted partners for hate speech or whatever. But now they're like, oh, we're going to do some research, and we're going to see, like, is white nationalism a problem? Do we have to ban white nationalists from Twitter? It's like, you guys, now this is the funny part, because, well, it's not actually funny at all. It's really disturbing and shows exactly the power of language. These words like white supremacy, white privilege, racism, implicit bias, a student looked at these words to see how often they appeared in news articles over the last, 20 years. And all of these words, for some reason, started spiking in 2012. Some of them appear now 10 times as much as they did 10 years ago. And that's very strange. Why would that be happening? It's not like we've had a huge spike in racial incidents or a huge spike in racism or anything. actually, another study has found that Americans' racism has actually declined significantly in the last 10 years. So why, if racism is on the decline, are we hearing about it so often? If not because we want the powers that be want this to be forefront in our consciousness, this divide and conquer, this let's turn one race against the other, or let's you and him fight, as they say. Um, this is pretty obvious, like, divide and conquer operation, and the fact that we are not calling it out because we don't want to look like a bigot, or we don't want to look like some sort of racist, then that's too bad, because we need all the allies that we can get, and if we're at each other's throats and not looking above to who is pulling the strings, then that's our loss, and we lose. Another word that is having its meaning basically shredded and thrown up into the air like confetti is emergency. As you might have noticed, we've been in a constant state of emergency since basically 9/11. That was when it was decided that all rights were to be thrown by the wayside in order to have security and safety, because, yeah, I mean, well, that came out of nowhere, yeah, except for, like, the dozens of whistleblowers who tried to say, hey, I think people might be plotting something. I mean, yeah, so some people did something, and therefore we all had to give away our rights, in the immortal words of Ilhan Omar. Yeah, so because some people did something, we have to give away our rights, and it's an emergency, and it will be an emergency forever and ever and ever. Notice they never undeclare these emergencies. Now, it's physically impossible, like neurochemically speaking, to maintain a state of emergency for, 20 years? Almost 20 years now. Because your brain just doesn't have that much adrenaline, and it doesn't have that much cortisol and all these other hormones, and your body doesn't have all these chemical substances to continue the stress response for 20 years straight. So obviously it hasn't been a constant state of emergency, but they have to pretend it has been in order to keep the rights suspended. The suspension of habeas corpus, suspension of all of these things, and then just throw the Patriot Act in there as if like some rotting body thrown on a fire. It almost puts it out, but doesn't quite. The fire is still kind of there underneath, but it smells really bad, and like fluids are leaking out, and this is a really unpleasant analogy, so I'm going to stop here. But yeah, emergency doesn't actually mean emergency anymore, and so you have things like Trump declaring an emergency at the border. An emergency is just a means to an end, basically. He's declaring the emergency so he can free up money to build his wall. It's a means to depriving Americans of their rights. It's a means, in the case of the quote-unquote measles emergency, to just removing that pesky, like, religious freedom exemption from vaccine regulations, vaccine mandates, rather. And, I mean, measles, there's been, a couple hundred cases in New York City, which is where the mayor has declared a measles emergency in a couple of zip codes. Anybody who doesn't have the vaccine is going to get fined $1,000 per day. And if they don't pay that, they're going to go to jail. And they might even get vaccinated involuntarily. That's what they're talking about. That's what the health minister was talking about when this emergency was declared a couple months ago. Measles hasn't killed anybody. It's killed one person in the last 15 years. It's not a very serious disease if you don't have underlying conditions, and this being a first world country, at least technically, most people don't. People generally tend to live through it, and actually if you live through measles, you have a lifelong immunity, unlike the vaccine where you have to get at least a second or even third shot, and otherwise if you're exposed to it, you'll get it. This is why there have been actually so many measles cases. It's not all unvaccinated people who are getting the disease. I mean, the epidemic in Disneyland a couple of years ago was mostly vaccinated kids. In Washington, mostly vaccinated kids. The vaccine is not the be-all, end-all of immunity as they claim it was. I mean, a couple of employees of Merck are suing the company for faking the effectiveness numbers of its mumps vaccine. And that flight attendant on El Al Airlines that collapsed with the measles, she was vaccinated, or he, I'm not really sure if it was a she or he, but they were vaccinated. So, I mean, measles emergency is really a misnomer, except in the current sense of emergency, which just means this is an excuse I will use to take something from you that you do not want to give up. That's what an emergency is. It's been weaponized to just basically mean, oh, well, I can seize power and do whatever I want. It was first emergency powers in the wake of 9/11 what gave us the Patriot Act and what gave us basically the start of the beginning of the end. I mean, that was when the war first came home. I mean, so ever since then, it's been a steady stream of repealing Americans' rights and this psychological warfare. War has moved into our imaginations where once it was fought on the ground more and more. I mean, this latest thing with Iran, you see, like, oh, well, there's threat streams, which is a new word, which doesn't mean anything, which, I mean, just the phrase threat streams is literally pissing on your leg and telling you it's raining. That's what threat streams means. But it's like, because they can't even say threats anymore because there are no threats. I mean, the intelligence came from Mossad, of all people, who is just, oh, you know, they're just disinterested. They've only wanted to get us into war with Iran for the last 50 years. I mean, maybe not 50 years, but I guess since the 70s when the Ayatollah took power and overthrew the U.S. puppet regime. But it's really quite embarrassing that we're taking any intelligence from Mossad about Iran as gospel truth, because these people obviously are interested. I mean, Netanyahu's made it his life mission to get the U.S. to wipe up Iran for him. And, I mean, I can't say that his failure to form a government upsets me at all. I mean, I hope in the coming election that somebody takes power from him, because he's not doing a very good job now, is he? I mean, no, I'm sure, I take that back. I know that the night before the elections, there's going to be, oh, here comes some Hamas rockets. Oh no, save us, Bibi. You're our only hope. The bottle rockets, they are so scary. One landed in an open field. It's so transparent and bullshitty. I mean, like, and then they try to do one of those and blame it on Iran. And it's like, dude, you know, you're getting your fake enemies confused. That's a Hamas thing. Iran doesn't do the bottle rockets. They have real rockets. Why would they waste, like, their first strike on some, like, shitty bottle rocket in the middle of the green zone where there's nobody there because the U.S. cleared out all of its diplomats just a few days earlier because, you know, something might happen, and then, whoops, something did. It's almost like they're psychic. I mean, I wrote an article about this, too. I think we just need to recognize that there's this war on language going on and be very careful to point it out when we see it, because basically the U.S. loses every war it declares. We had the war on terror, which, I mean, it was first declared in Afghanistan, which we're now negotiating, basically suing for peace with the Taliban because they're winning. They won. It's been almost 20 years, and we have nothing to show for it except a bunch of dead people. Dead soldiers, dead civilians, dead Afghans, dead everybody, and a shitload of wasted money. And it's really embarrassing. I mean, even I think almost 3/4 of veterans of that war think that we have no business being there. Many of them think it was a mistake, and it's got to be very difficult to admit that the war that you fought, that you lost friends and your colleagues in, that you probably were psychologically damaged by, if not physically, that was a waste of time. And the fact that these people are admitting it in such great numbers really proves it's a goddamn waste of time. Get out. And I have people trying to tell me that, oh, well, you know, I mean, Trump really wants to get out of Afghanistan, so, like, we should support him. Well, then why isn't he? I mean, it's not like he had to appoint these warmongers to surround him in his inner circle. Nobody was pointing a gun at him and saying, you have to hire John Bolton, the guy who was so much of a scary warmonger that even the Bush administration couldn't deal with him. Dude, the Bush administration can't deal with this motherfucker, and you are, like, giving him the keys to the kingdom? He's the national security motherfucking advisor. That's a really powerful position. And then Pompeo, who thinks the rapture is going to be here any minute now. Yeah, so we lose every war that we declare. War on terror, toast, no, not working. I mean, just not. For one thing, because we're funding the terror at the same time we're fighting it, so that doesn't really work. And of course, the terror that we're not funding personally, then Israel is funding, Saudi Arabia is funding, United Arab Emirates is funding, all of our allies are funding terror. So, like, blaming it on Iran is just not going to fly. We're causing the same thing we claim to be fighting, and it's really embarrassing. And it's like the same thing that happens when Israel, when ISIS apologizes for accidentally hitting Israel. It's like, does anybody really believe that these two are not in bed together? It's like, what more proof of smoking gun do you need? You have to actually walk in on them, like ISIS giving Israel a blowjob? Like, how much more of proof do you need? This is embarrassing. So, there's that. War on drugs, of course, totally lost. I mean, we're legalizing pot now, and half the country is hooked on heroin. The other half is soon to be hooked on heroin. It's really bad because, like, you know, you can get a lot more done if you're not on drugs, But apparently, like, it's a disease of despair for sure. I don't hold with the whole AA/NA/12-step model that addiction is a disease and it's your brain and you can't do anything about it and it's going to be with you for the rest of your life. But it does actually like rewire your brain chemistry a bit. You have to rewire it in order to recover. But it's not a thing that's like with you for the rest of your life and you can't ever recover and you have to give yourself to a higher power. No, that's a very imperialist way of looking at it, and there's no accident that has become the dominant paradigm. But of course, now that everybody is hooked on drugs in this country, you're going to see a lot more of that. A lot of people giving over their locus of decision making. I mean, there's been studies done that show that people who, as far as addicts who are recovering, the ones who give their self over to a higher power actually have a lower rate of recovery than the ones who keep the locus of decision making within themselves. So just think of that. Think of that if you're evaluating recovery programs or on behalf of a loved one or yourself. Just, it's important to keep that in mind. I think that 12 Steps is one of the biggest scams on the face of the earth. Anyway, let's see, what other wars we lost? The war on poverty, that's a big one. The statistics vary depending on which publication you read it in, but something like 2/3 of Americans don't have an extra $600 to cover emergency expense. An actual emergency expense, not an emergency expense. See how I have to qualify that? See how that lessens the effectiveness of my communication? This is a problem. But anyway, so most Americans don't have money and can't afford houses. Homelessness is at record highs in many cities, I think across the country, but I know it's at a record high in New York, in like West Coast cities, San Francisco, whatever. So that's a big problem. War on poverty was declared in, I think, the 1960s under Lyndon Johnson. Mr. I'm not going to embarrass our allies for a couple of dead sailors. Yeah, sure, dude. Rot in hell. They've done surveys of like every generation. Most people in every generation, I think like 4/5 of people in every generation, don't know when or if they'll ever be able to pay off their debts. So I would say that when you've got a society where everybody's in debt, where the whole country is so deep in debt, it's just not even possible to think of ever climbing out, you've lost the war on poverty. Let's put it that way. I mean, poverty has wiped the floor with the United States, and I don't see that getting any better unless, we did something loony like audit the Fed or close the doors of the Fed, or, put them in the stocks and throw rotten tomatoes at them. I mean, nothing too good for the old boys at the Fed. Anyway, so declaring a war on something is a great way for the U.S. to lose that war. I mean, a war on communism. Dude, look at China. I mean, I know, they're not completely communist, but the U.S. declared a war on communism, and now China is wiping the floor with us. I mean, mopping the floor with us. I'm getting my metaphors mixed. But basically, yeah, the idea of this war on language is very definitely to make it impossible to communicate ideas that run contrary to the ruling class. I mean, they're doing this mentally by doing this to our ability to reason and to have language, but they're also doing this in the physical world as far as these filters. I mean, they're trying to impose a pre-upload filter in Europe, this Article 13 stuff, the filter net, and in the US they're trying to do this with all these hate speech laws, and it's complete nonsense bullshit. But basically to make it impossible to say certain things and to communicate certain ideas without couching it in multiple layers of disqualifiers and, or qualifiers rather, and euphemisms and hints and other like codes. And so by the time you've actually said the thing, it doesn't mean anything anymore. And the person you're communicating with, chances are they're not going to understand it either, or they're going to misunderstand it, and then you're back at square one. So, I mean, language is basically all we've got. They can take everything away from us, but as long as we can talk, we still have our language. Don't let them take that too. It's not worth it. Whatever they're giving you in return, it's not worth it. But anyway, so if we can get these people to declare this an actual war and lose it like they have every other war, then maybe we stand a chance. Right now, it's pretty scary because they control the means of... basically, they're trying to clamp down on the internet in such a way that even videos like this will not be possible because YouTube will have filters in place to block certain words or certain phrases when they're uploaded. And then you get a little dialogue box that says, "Oops, something went wrong." Yeah, our society. Something went wrong. YouTube likes to do disappearing view counts on my videos, so feel free to download this, post it to your own channel. I would appreciate if you link back to mine, or go to helenofdestroy.com for
more of my stuff. But yeah, just get the message out there, because that's what's important. It doesn't matter who's saying it. Make your own videos about this stuff. And if you uncover any other words that you think are really egregiously being turned inside out, do your own video, because this stuff is pretty obscene, and it needs to be called out. This cannot continue. We need to be able to communicate effectively, or else we got nothing.